You are watching a Healing Element Podcast special. Show your support by subscribing to the Healing Element Podcast YouTube channel. Also, follow us on Instagram at the Healing Element Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Healing Element Podcast. I am your host, Kai Marie, and welcome back for this special episode. This is part 2 of the interview that I did with my special guest, Thurston Smith. He is back to dive a little bit deeper into our conversation regarding the history of policing in America and its impact on the Black community. Thurston, welcome back to the program. Always an honor to have you.
Oh, thank you, Kai.
And I love that you had that picture posted because it does such a great job illustrating the frustration, the experience of Black people in this country. So thank you for just providing that imagery, because sometimes we can talk about data, we can use words to express what our experience is like, but when you put a picture to it, sometimes that can silence you and just cause you to reflect and really think.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. And had I been more savvy, right? Had I been more tech savvy, I would actually have that picture as a backdrop behind me. But you know
I know. StreamYard won't let us be great, Thurston.
Exactly.
So we're gonna work on that. That's something that is a project that we're working on.
Absolutely. So good to be back. I'm so grateful that you've invited me back. So thanks.
Yes, and you have such experience. And anybody that has watched the first time that you came on the podcast, that's when we were talking about breaking the cycle, the generational cycle of substance use.
Yeah.
Then we went into the conversation about policing, the history of policing in this country and its impact on the Black community. Today we're doing part 2. So we've had some really heavy topics that you've been able to really break down in digestible bits to help us understand. So for those that may be tuning in for the first time, what I want to say is make sure you go to the links that are in the description box to check out the previous interviews that I've done with Thurston. They are dynamic. This is why he keeps coming back. And I have plans for him to come back again and again and again. So make sure you check out the previous episodes. And I think one thing I will say is how Thurston is able to break down very complex topics. For example, when we were talking about the generational cycle of substance use, that's something, if you are a family dealing with that's something you can sit and watch with your family. These are everything that he goes over. Not only is he providing what the problem is, but also some solutions. So make sure you check that out. As far as the one that we did with policing, make sure you also check that one out. Again, another great episode to watch with your family and even your children. Our young Black boys and girls, they need to know the history of policing, why we're seeing what we're seeing in this country. So please make sure you check out those. Again, the link for those can be found in the description box. So Thurston, for those that, if this is their first time meeting you, there's so many accolades that you had because you've been doing outstanding work in our community. Can you share a little bit with us about the work that you've done as it relates to criminal justice reform?
Well, okay. Well, again, thanks again for having me on the show. In a little while, just a few moments ago when you were talking about my background and expertise, and it's kind of interesting because I actually made a Facebook post today, right? I had an epiphany. And I think I made a comment to this effect, that some people have just enough information to think that they're right, but not enough information to recognize when they're wrong.
Wow, I like that.
And so, it's kind of interesting. I've been doing this work for a while. And generally, folks folks may give me the label of expert, and so I'm a little bit cautious with that, because the more I learn, Kai, the more I realize I don't know. If that makes sense.
It makes sense.
You know, it's somewhat, it's paradoxical, but having said that, I'm constantly studying. So to answer your question more directly, my involvement in criminal justice, my involvement in other areas of public policy and civic engagement and public health all began many years ago when I came into the counseling field. And the reason for that is, when I came into the substance abuse and mental health counseling field, back during that period, there was this push for having counselors and other practitioners working in those disciplines. There was a push to have those individuals trained in secondary disciplines. So, but there's a large number, obviously, of individuals that have history, that have criminal histories, prior offenders, current offenders, that end up seeking mental health and drug treatment services. So there's one example of why it was so very important to learn about that population and all of the nuances that go along with it.
Right.
But I've served on a number of commissions. I've received a few gubernatorial appointments by 2 or 3 governors and a few mayors. I've served 3 terms, almost completed 3 terms. Each term was 2 years, but I served 2.5 terms. I served exactly 5 years on the Shelby County Juvenile Justice Consortium, which is here in Memphis, Tennessee. And in fact, I was the first chairperson of that body. And if you don't mind me giving you a little bit of history,
please do.
That body was established, if my memory is correct, that body was established on either December 12th or December 17th. Memorandum of agreement was established by the U.S. Justice Department and the Shelby County government in December of 2012, which generally mandated that the county government, the juvenile court system, that entire juvenile justice apparatus, establish a citizens review board. That's the best way of describing it. The formal name of that body is the Shelby County Juvenile Justice Consortium. Well, anyway, I was among the first cohort, or the first cadre or group of individuals that were publicly appointed to that body by the Shelby County Mayor and the Shelby County Commission. And interestingly, I was elected as that body's first chairperson. And that board, or if you will, that body, that consortium, was charged with somewhat of a dual role. One of its key roles was to share information with the general public within this community, within the Memphis Shelby County community, regarding the progress of the juvenile court system. And then on the flip side of the coin, our body was charged with providing the juvenile justice system with input regarding the community's concerns. Many years ago, the U.S. Justice Department came to Shelby County and identified that there were several civil rights infractions that were occurring within the juvenile justice system here in Shelby County. those infractions surrounded disproportionate minority contact, equal protection, due process, and those types of dynamics. And so subsequent to the identification of those problems within the system here, the U.S. Justice Department established a memorandum of agreement with Shelby County government, and part of that memorandum mandated that the county government here establish a consortium, a citizens body that was in fact independent of the juvenile system to help, at least so we could operate with some transparency. Since the body, well, it was a brand new concept, started, from ground up, it was kind of bumpy because this had never been done before. And so there was some ambivalence within the system about our role, how we were going to do what we did, who did what, when, where, how, and why, so on and so forth. But in any event, I served, essentially 3 terms on that body. I'm currently in my 2nd term on the Tennessee Community Resource Board for the Tennessee Department of Corrections. I was nominated to serve on that body by, actually, he's the current county mayor, but he was actually a Tennessee state senator. That was in fact Lee Harris. And so I'm serving in that role with the Tennessee Department of Corrections. I formerly worked for Court Services and Offender Supervision Agency, which is a federal agency in Washington, D.C. that was created under the, if I remember correctly, under the 1997 District of Columbia Self-Government and Revitalization Act. It's either 1997 or 2001, one or the other, because I'm getting I have the dates, but sometimes I've misplaced the dates with the wrong entity. But what they did during that act, and this kind of really amazes me of what the federal government is actually capable of. So what they did in that act is they merged DC government's probation, parole, pretrial intervention services, and court services into one super federal agency where the director of that agency is actually appointed by the President of the United States. But anyway, I worked for them for a short period. So the name of the agency is Court Services and Offender Supervision Agency for the District of Columbia. It's a federal agency that exclusively serves offenders that are residents within the District of Columbia. So I did some work for them. I've also served as a consultant for the U.S. Attorney's Office briefly. I did some training for the FBI and DEA and other local law enforcement. And what's the other thing that I wanted to share? And I've also served as a consultant for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, done several trainings for correction officers and inmates at Indian Creek Correctional Institution in Virginia, State Correctional Institution, Waynesburg, which I think is right on the borderline of Pennsylvania and West Virginia. And I've done several trainings at the, Federal Bureau of Prisons, Federal Correctional Institutions, Estill and Edgefield, both of which are in South Carolina. And I've done some consulting and training for the U.S. District Court here in the state of Tennessee, as well as in Alabama. So a little bit, moderate amount of criminal justice experience. And then,
moderate.
Well, no, I wasn't. I don't. There's plenty of individuals that have far more work and expertise in the area than I do. So, I think it's probably be in my best interest to play that a little bit with a little sense of humility and be a little bit moderate about it. I've got a little bit of experience. Yes.
Yeah, well, we definitely appreciate the experience that you do have, because you can really speak to the inner workings of the justice system. And one thing that we did not have the opportunity to do in our last interview for part one, we didn't really talk too much about the juvenile system, that's something that we're going to really dive into a little bit more today. So I'm looking forward to that conversation as well. So if you are listening right now, please make sure you hit the like button. Engagement always helps. So if you have any questions for Thurston, if you have any comments, please just drop it in the comment box, so that way I can present it to him and we can answer any questions that you may have. And please also share this video. So starting off now, we wanted to talk, I know the history of policing is deep, it goes deep. So Thurston did talk a little bit, I wouldn't say a little, you kind of went in depth during part one, but I think there were some particulars that you wanted to focus on as policing as it relates to what was taking place during Jim Crow.
Exactly.
So with that being said, I'll turn over to you. Again, if you guys have any questions at any point, just drop it in the comment section and I will bring it to Thurston.
Okay. Kai, you and I had an opportunity after the first podcast, after part one. And you know how we ended up kind of, and I'm probably my biggest critique, but I didn't think, in reflecting, I didn't think that I really covered all of the key items regarding the history of policing in America, particularly as it relates to Reconstruction and prior to Reconstruction. And so there were approximately, following the Emancipation Proclamation, there were approximately 4 million slaves, that were given their freedom. And so, and if you can kind of think of that like in the massive number that it is, it's like, where were these 4 million freed slaves supposed to go? I mean, so it wasn't even any concept, right, or any legitimacy if you just want to have a general discussion about it regarding 40 acres and a mule. So we're not there. So you have to understand, and this is researchable information, is that cotton was king, right? Cotton was responsible for largely approximately 60 to 70% of the U.S. economy during that time. So it was the gross domestic product, if you will, at least in the South of that day and age. So freeing slaves was a threat to the economic system, not largely within the South, but it also impacted the entire country. So the question that was being presented to white Americans during that time is, how were they going to survive? Just looking at that from an economic perspective, A. B, you would have to also look at that freeing slaves was merely a cultural shock within the South during that time. And so, speeding this discussion up, what they established during that era, and we talked a little bit about this during the first podcast on this, on part one, but what they established during that time, Kai, were what was referred to as black codes. There were 2 states that implemented black codes. Black codes were laws of those states. And the 2 states that implemented the first black codes were Mississippi and South Carolina. So let me give you one of the black codes that was established in Mississippi. Mississippi's law during that time required Black people to have written evidence of employment, not just current, but for the coming year. Now, do you understand what I'm trying to tell you? Black people, freed slaves during that time, not only had to produce evidence, right, of employment, but they also had to demonstrate that they were going to be employed in the future. If they did not, and if they were not able to do that, they were either forced into contract labor. If they refused that, they were jailed. And the other thing is, if they left, if they did enter into a contract in that state, and virtually all of those contract services were all surrounding agriculture. So they were still in the cotton field. So that's understand that, right? So if they left before the coming year, then they were forced to forfeit wages regarding that. And if they didn't submit the wages, they were arrested. And when they were arrested, they were put in prisons. And during that era, and to some extent still exists now during that era, the prison industrialized complex was in prison labor was by and large agriculture. So they kept us on the field, right? They kept us on the field one way or the other. In South Carolina, the state of South Carolina enacted a law that prohibited Black people from holding any occupation other than that of a farmer or a servant. If not, they were forced to pay an annual tax between $10 to $100 back in that era.
Right. And Thurston, I just wanted to say really quick, I think what you're illustrating right now shows how the system evolves.
Correct.
To make sure that it still controls the certain group of people, right?
That's
so it's
correct.
Like, oh no, you're no longer a slave, but here are all these other stipulations to make sure that these group of people stay in this certain caste system in this society.
Exactly.
As the system continues to, so that's something to think about as Thurston lays this out when we begin to approach present day. How is the system continuing to evolve to produce the same type of outcomes?
Absolutely. Similar Black codes, Kai, were vagrancy laws. So, I mean, you couldn't even be moving, from one place to the other. The stop and frisk practices of today, and you have to understand, Kai, there was the establishment of militia groups in America, by and large, began in the South. And they began as patrols to harass, detain Black people. That whole concept of, when we look at the stop and frisk policies of today, even Tim Wise, the social activist, author, university lecturer, talks about this in many of his lectures. And if I can quote Tim Wise says, this is precisely why African Americans of today historically trace the police practices, the modern police practices, to the slave patrols of yesterday. So there were vagrancy laws. So even back then, we couldn't walk, we couldn't run, we couldn't sit. Do you understand where I'm going with this? Right? The 13th Amendment was ratified, Kai, on December 6, 1965. The first section of the 13th Amendment declares that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, comma, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. And so there's a clause within the Constitution that still gives them permission to enslave us if we are in the criminal justice system. You get the picture? So there's been a long commitment, not just a long commitment, but obviously a long commitment that's tied to a long history of undermining the survival, the humanity of Black people. And it is absolutely profound. It is undeniable, the data that's there. The practices that we see today, just about every single one of them can be linked and tied to the historical practices of post-Reconstruction.
So true, Thurston. Yeah. It's so true, and those groups, right, are still making money off of the labor and keeping them, whether it be in print when they were during when there were Black codes, or even what's going on right now. There's still this whole machine that's making money off of that. So society just had to adjust for whatever time it was in to still make money off of us.
Why do we, well, exactly, which is why I'm so glad that among his first executive action since entering the Oval Office, President Biden put an end to federal contracts with private prisons. I mean, look at that concept. Every private business that we know, from Walgreens to Walmart to Nike to Kentucky Fried Chicken to McDonald's to Kohl's to Best Buy, every private business, including your own, Kai, and you're an entrepreneur, every private business has a marketing strategy. And that marketing strategy generally surrounds two things, right? And I'm not a business expert, but I think I know this much. Generally surrounds two things. How do they get their product out to as many individuals, groups, and communities as possible, A, and B, how do they make as much money as possible? All private businesses have a marketing strategy. So if your private business is a private correctional or penal institution, then what is your marketing strategy? And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure this out. So if I was the director or president or CEO of a private prison industry, then my number one goal is to keep my prisons full. And how do you do that? Let me tell you a few ways of how you do that. Number one, you give money to politicians to vote for legislation that support private penal institutions. That's number one. Number two, you develop relationships within the government, and that's either federal, state, and in some instances county, right? So you smooth those dynamics that will allow that will provide for access and negotiations. And then number three, you support an already existing racist system that does not care for Black people and other people of color, and you toe the line to maintain the status quo. we need not have any public-private partnerships between any governmental entity and the private prison industry, either for adults or juveniles. And you've got juvenile detention centers that are under public-private partnerships as well, not just adult penal institutions.
And Thurston, you've done a lot of work, especially in the juvenile system. Can you explain to viewers right now a little bit background about this juvenile system, and the work that you've done? Like, what did you see that you said, oh, we got to come in here and make some changes?
Okay, so let me give you three things that I have experience in as it relates to juvenile justice system. So one, I've got some policy experience as it relates to juvenile. Not a lot, but some, right? I've also got I'm also a youth mentor. So it's kind of interesting that I've done policy work on one hand, but then I've also taken time to go into the juvenile system to mentor some of the youth there, talk with them, give lectures, that kind of thing. And thirdly, as a child and youth services program evaluator, I evaluate youth juvenile justice programs around the country. So that's kind of the framework of my knowledge and expertise as it relates to juvenile justice. And so I've visited a few juvenile justice programs around the country. And so some of them were in group home format, and many of them are miniature prisons. And you have to understand, even my home state of New York City, juveniles, C-76, if I'm correct, in Rikers Island, and I think the name of that center is called Juveniles at War. Matter of fact, when you get off, when we're done with this podcast, Google Rikers Island. Just Google Rikers Island Juveniles at War. That's either C-76 or C-74. And so Rikers Island was filled with juveniles, under the age of 18, and rough up in there. Rough up, just the culture and an environment of that. So this is my greatest concern as a counselor and as a minister. This is my greatest concern. Number one, children, believe it or not, don't know what they're doing. They don't really have, at age 13, 14, 15, 16, even 17 and 18, even 17 and 18, do not have or not mature enough to understand the consequences of their behavior. That's number one. And we've had, and it's not until recently or recent years that they changed the law in New York for juveniles to be sent to adult prisons. It was 16. They moved it to 18. And I think there's maybe one state or one or two states left in the country that's below 18. And several of them, and I think Tennessee is one of those, that have provisions that allow them to put juveniles in adult prisons depending upon their crime. And so very, very complex. But one of the things that disturbed me working here locally in the system, particularly when I used to go visit the juveniles, is seeing them in these orange jumpsuits. I mean, can you just imagine looking at a 14, 15, 16-year-old kid in a bright orange jumpsuit with prison slippers on, that kind of thing. But meanwhile, the system, is generally presenting to the public that they're doing everything that they can to help them. B, that they are implementing therapeutics. And Kai, you know what that word means. Both you and I know what that word means. They're implementing therapeutics. Anytime you hear the word therapy, the word therapy is synonymous with the word healing. So there's the impression, right, that what we're doing with those youth in that system is for their good and aimed toward their healing. You can't do that with them in orange jumpsuits. Why do you need to have them in orange jumpsuits? Most penal institutions will tell you, we have them in those suits so we can identify them. But let me tell you what a colleague of mine told me a couple of weeks ago. You don't need them in orange jumpsuits. Everybody without a badge is a resident. It's just that simple. Everybody that doesn't have a badge is a resident. And here's the other thing. If you have to identify them with clothing, then allow them to, wear jeans. And some institutions do that, and that kind of thing. But this whole, even as early as I can remember, my first visit to the first juvenile detention center that I've been to, the very first thing that crossed my mind, the very first thing, is that they are preparing them for adult prison. And there are other indicators that give you that. Not just the clothing, but the framework of the system, the paint on the wall, the arrangement of furniture. You would have to go to understand exactly what I'm talking about. So many juvenile centers look, matter of fact, they look identical to adult prisons in many shape, form, and fashion. Iron doors, big key, one big key, those kinds of things, rather than standard doors that you can lock and bolt. And obviously you have some youth in there. And here's the thing. This is the correlation between mental health and criminal justice. The overwhelming majority, a recent case that I helped out with over the past couple of months with a young man suffering from attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. This is not a cop-out. And I encourage your listeners to just Google attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and look at the symptoms. You're talking about a medical condition. One of the core symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is ability to concentrate. Number two, the ability to focus on one thing for a given period of time. All of those kinds of things. Number three, hyper. One of the other core symptoms, core criteria of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is hyper-impulsivity. I had a cousin. I have a cousin. I didn't have a cousin. He's an adult now, but I have a cousin that suffers from attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. He used to get in trouble all the just could not keep still. And they put him on Ritalin. And the ironic thing is Ritalin is a stimulant. And so you got to understand the real dynamics of that. Why would you give a stimulant to somebody that's already overstimulated? But that's another conversation. But do you see what I'm saying? So we have those dynamics. And what makes it bad is many of these youth come from single parent homes, if that, or they're living with their grandmother. Lots of dysfunction. They're attending a school that really serves as a school to prison pipeline, right? The data has it that African-American children don't act out anymore in classroom than white kids, but they handle our children differently. And the punishment for our children, even in the school system, is far more severe than any other group and far more severe than warranted. You know, long-term expulsions, those kinds of things. Everything that continues to put individuals further back and further undermines those individuals' quality of life and ability to grow up. So think about that. If you're already in a dysfunctional system, single parent home, if that, troubled neighborhood, impoverished neighborhood, low income in the home. I guess what I'm trying to describe to you is all of these things that Black youth, and these are not excuses because I was one of those, but it just so happened that I had I came from a two-parent home until my father died. But when I was growing up in Brooklyn, I mean, it was dangerous going, just going to school. Yeah, and that was during that time. The era that we're in now is far, far, far more dangerous than when it was when I was growing up. But when we look at all of these, and I guess what I'm trying to describe to you, Kai, are all of these different dynamics that are working against us as a people. And by and large, and I know folks can say, here he goes with these, they are not excuses. They are not excuses. But by and large, these conditions, that the current conditions that we are in now, are either influenced directly or indirectly by our government's public policy. For example, and I talked about this during the first episode, let's just look at President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, 1934, established the housing system that we know today. As part of his economic plan, and it was a stimulus then, to stimulate the economy during the Great Depression, his plan encouraged banks to lend money. And they said very specifically, this was written public policy, Blacks are risky, just like that. Now, what does that mean? If you disseminate a public policy, an executive order from the highest office in the land to SunTrust, name some banks for me. BB&T. BB&T.
That Chase Bank, yeah.
Chase Bank, Wells Fargo. So imagine you getting, no different than the payroll protection executive actions that took place during the prior administration in light of COVID-19 that has been disseminated throughout the country, private sector. So imagine back then, you being the president of a bank and you getting the executive order from the president of the United States, encouraging you to giving you guidance on what you can do to stimulate the economy. And it says very explicitly, Blacks are risky. It said that. So what does that mean? That means you don't lend Blacks, you don't lend money to Black. Let me tell you what else his policies did. His policies, that was the beginning of eminent domain. This is when they began gentrification. This is when they began establishing highways through Black neighborhoods. They did that in major cities throughout the country. LA is one of them, which by and large, they did that in Chicago. By and large, is responsible for the deterioration of those neighborhoods, and the creation of gangs came out of that.
And Thurston, one other point to add, even when you look at the GI Bill, that's when you had a lot of white families beginning to build their wealth, and many Black families could not take advantage of that. So at every point when it could have been a great opportunity for the Black community to begin to be able to build family and community, their legs were cut out right beneath them.
Exactly. In order to build wealth, you need to possess three things. You either need to own stock, you either need to own a business, or you need to own property. Economic Development 101 tells us that home ownership is a principle and foundational wealth building entity. Home ownership, owning property. And that's precisely why Black people have not been able to pass wealth on generationally. All of those things are undermined. And this is what disturbs me so much. For those people that are non-Black, right? Who, they don't say this, but the inference is there, is that Black people are shifty, Black people are lazy, all of these lies. And then the ironic thing is, we were brought here to build this country, to make things easier for white people through our work, but we're lazy, right? So all of those myths about Black people, but no reference to the policies that have been established in this country. So I want you to understand this. My father was denied entrance my father was a New York City law enforcement officer. My father was denied entrance into the FBI by J. Edgar Hoover because he was Black. During that era, J. Edgar Hoover, if he let Black people in the FBI, and there's a couple, they were light-skinned Blacks, lighter than you, Kai, and they had another quality as well. I won't get into that, what that was. Okay? Those are the people that he was letting into the FBI. So I want you to understand this. Had my father been allowed into the FBI, into the Justice Department in the 1950s or 60s or whatever it was, I may be in a totally different place today. This is my point. This is what I want Americans, everyone, Black, white, Puerto Rican, everybody in between, to understand. It's not Black folks sitting around complaining. There have been legitimate historical policy, and this is the policies that have been implemented. That doesn't even account for the other things that have been done to Black people to undermine their progress. But these things, they have a domino effect. So for example, even though Franklin Delano Roosevelt's policies were implemented in the 1930s, the remnants of that are still present today. And if we look at it numerically, how many generations is that? From me back then, that accounts for 3 generations. So 3 generations have lacked the opportunity to build wealth because of one set of policies. Let me also say that it was those policies that also established redlining. They drew a map. They literally drew a map. And I encourage your participants to look this up. They literally drew a map. They did the schematics of it. I mean, they broke it down methodically and highlighted all of the Black neighborhoods and specifically said, you will not do anything here, unless you move them out, purchase their property, And so that was the legitimate, the first signs, the first practices of what we call today gentrification. That's when that began, during that administration, during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, that served white America and not just served white America and didn't help Black America, it served white America and undermined Black America. So let's be clear about that. And so it increased poverty, it hindered economic opportunity. By and large, this is where your ghettos in Black communities come from.
No, so true. And for those that are listening, please make sure you give this video a thumbs up, like, and share. And I like what you said about it, Thurston, because it puts everything into context, what we're seeing, because a lot of this history that you laid out, we don't know. And a lot of times we begin to internalize and believe, oh, something is wrong with us. Maybe it is true what we're being told, that we're not, we don't work as hard, or things along those lines. But what you've laid out is that there is a system that's put in place to create these type of outcomes. And like we had talked about before, our dysfunction helps this country run.
Oh, that's right. And by and large, Kai, I believe that there are groups of people that do not want to see us do it. We fix everything else. We've passed laws to give women right to vote. We made that work. We passed laws that have allowed women to enter into the workforce and colleges and excel. We've passed laws that have benefited the members of the LGBT community, and in fact, the LGBT community many years ago, when they were doing their protesting and activism, tied their philosophy, or rather, let me rephrase that, linked on the coattail of the civil rights philosophy, or the philosophy rather of the civil rights movement, to argue their agenda. And they have made their advances. We are still arguing for equal justice under the law. We're still arguing for being treated as equals in a society. And that's the difference between equality and equity. Equality says all of the laws are for everybody. Yes, all of the laws, that's equality. All of the laws are for everybody. All of the laws apply to everybody. But equity speaks about fairness. And this is what we're lacking, because we have seen time and time again, particularly as it relates to encounters with law enforcement officers with America, we see very, very different outcomes when police interact with us. I've seen videos where white police officers were dealing with white men with knives, and the white police officers in some of those instances not only didn't draw their gun, they didn't even draw out their batons. I've seen one video where a white guy has a gun. They detained the guy without firing a shot. Then we've got all of these instances. Amir Rice. I mean, we can go on, and there's so many of them. Unwarranted murder of Black people with no weapon. We look at the Ahmaud Arbery case that occurred somewhere close to Statesboro, Georgia, with two guys, one former police officer and his son. They self-appointed militias. and we talked about this, slave patrol. They know the history. And so when we have this discussion, somehow everybody gets kind of like, everyone develop, when I say everyone, obviously I don't mean everyone, but folks develop amnesia. But they know the history. These practices or in other words, they communicate one thing to us, but they communicate something entirely different to each other about us. And then we need to be clear about that. It's no accident. You shoot a guy jogging. I have stopped by in every community that I've lived in my life. I have stopped by houses that were underdeveloped and stepped on the inside and looked at that. And people do that all the time. But when a Black person does it, he's up to no good. See, these are the messages, right? Right? That's communicated about Black men. And they've been communicating those messages about us ever since Reconstruction. And it has continued. All of these lies and myths about Black people being dangerous and all of these kind of things. Will the real threat to society please stand up? I don't think it's Black people. I'm just speaking frankly. We don't have any history of sicking dogs on innocent women and children. We don't do that. We don't have any history of bombing and blowing up churches anywhere. We don't have a history of that. We don't have any history of just randomly going down the street and shooting white people under any circumstance. We got a history of killing each other, and I can talk to you where that comes from. I am under the research substantiates and validates that the majority of issues that ail African Americans, the most prominent problems that we have are either a direct or indirect remnant of slavery and the policies relating that America has established. Those are the source of our problems here. Right. We want to succeed. We want to do that. And I am also under the firm belief, and you are included in this, right? So here's a commendation from you. I am also under the belief, and I believe this, that every Black person that you see in this country that is successful is a miracle. Because I'm here to tell you, I know I am, because I know what I've been through. So it's a myth to talk about, I can even remember when, Barack Obama was elected. Well, we got a Black president. That's symbolism. And that's all that is. We've made progress. Well, yeah, there has been some progress. In order for him to have been elected president, that's indicative. But what we need to understand is that we still have an apparatus that continues to perpetuate practices. And this is what so even if we passed a law tomorrow that said everybody needs to be nice to everybody, tomorrow everybody's still not going to be nice to everybody. So the reason why I'm referencing that, Con, is let's understand, even when we do pass meaningful legislation, and even when positive, uplifting laws are enacted, it still takes quite some time for that culture to acclimate and become accustomed to that new law. Everything relating to that law does not change overnight. And we need to understand that. This is precisely why we have a system that is in place. And let me tell you something. Paul Manafort, who was sentenced a couple of years ago, and he was one of Trump's aides. Paul Manafort was supposed to go to Rikers Island, either on his way there or after he got there. They swooped him up out of there. And let me tell you what they said. They said he had health conditions. Well, there's an infirmary on Rikers Island. And there's several inmates on Rikers Island in New York City that have health conditions. This is why I tell you the criminal justice system is a political system, and we need to understand that. And there's three things that make it a political system. Number one, the head of the criminal justice system in America, and that includes on the state level. Whether you look on the state level or on the federal level, the head of the criminal justice system is a political appointee. That makes it political. Number two, all of the ties of that penal institution or that criminal justice system is connected to other branches of the political system, i.e. the court system, the law enforcement system. These are all political systems. Thirdly, people in that system has an entire culture. Anybody that enters into the criminal justice system, whether or not you're guilty or not, you are vulnerable once you are in that system, and they can do just about anything they want to you while you're in that system. Individuals are very vulnerable once they enter into that criminal justice system. Anything above that are misdemeanor, and in some instances, even a misdemeanor. This is precisely why we need to get rid of the cash bail system, which goes totally contrary to, and I don't even remember the amendment, but it's totally contrary to the U.S. Constitution. I think it's contrary to the 14th Amendment as relates to equal protection under the law, those provisions, that kind of thing. Because the cash bail system is contrary to that. Because the law says that you are innocent until proven guilty. Rikers Island, and I don't know why I keep mentioning this, Rikers Island is America's, last time I looked at it, looked at the data, that is America's largest detention center, right? So approximately 70% of everybody that's on Rikers Island is on Rikers Island because they don't have money to pay bail. Some of them for minor drug offenses on Rikers Island. Same thing here, locally, 201 Poplar. Many people still locked up in it simply because they don't have the money. So here's the thing, you're innocent till proven guilty. So I want you to kind of massage that over and over and over. You're innocent until proven guilty. No, you're guilty until proven innocent. That's the reality. So we've got an erroneous message there that everybody's aware of, even those that work within the court system, from the DA, those that work within the criminal justice system. We got some laws, so ambiguous. The reality of it is you can indict a ham sandwich. And you have multiple judges in the criminal justice system, not just the one that sits in the court. Let me tell you the judges. Here's judge number one, the one that files a complaint on you. Anybody can say anything. Let's go to the Amy Cooper thing with the bird watcher in Harlem, in Central Park last year. He's bird watching, told her, I think he told her to watch a dog or something like that. And nice guy, because he was interviewed earlier, after the incident. She gets on the phone and calls the NYPD. Oh, it's a black man, all of that stuff. Right? She knew what to do. She knew exactly what buttons to push in order to utilize the system to harm somebody. And she's not the only one. I've been subjected to that. This is what black people go through day in and day out all over. In fact, many of us go through it so much, we've just learned ways of navigating around it. But that's how they use the criminal justice system. So that's judge number one. Judge number one is the person that files the complaint. Let me introduce you to judge number 2 in the criminal judge. Judge number 2 is the police officer. Police officers got a lot of discretion of who they're going to arrest, who they're going to write a ticket for, who they're going to detain. Then you go into the system, then you go before the other judge, and there's a 4th judge. Depending upon the crime, the 4th judge is the district attorney, who's a politician. So you've got some people who are serving time within the system because the DA was running for re-election, or do you understand what I'm saying? So individuals that enter into the criminal justice system are vulnerable once you're in there, unless you have money. And then even to some extent, even with money, there's still a level of vulnerability. So this is precisely why the criminal justice system, 33% of all of your drug-related convictions within America's criminal justice system are Black folks. 3 types of drug offenses, right? 3 types. Possession, use, and sale. Possession, use, and sale. And the overwhelming of individuals that are serving time, both on the state and federal level, are serving time for nonviolent drug offenses. That's the political framework of the criminal justice system.
And Thurston, there's one thing that you have that you mentioned a few times is about our humanity, our being the Black people, and our humanity being recognized. And we talked about our young people that are in the juvenile system.
Right.
And how, they're going there and now they're getting therapeutics, and many of them coming from environments that are dysfunctional, lots of trauma taking place. And so, when you don't have stability, who knows where your life can end up.
Right.
And so in order for this system that we have to work, as you said before, it operates in our dysfunction. It operates by not seeing our humanity. So I think one thing for those that are listening, it's so important to understand how the system works and understand that the outcomes that we see are planned. And this is not about white people liking us, wanting to be friends with us. This is about a system of control and dominating another group.
Right.
So if you're going to dominate another group, you can't see their humanity.
Exactly. And I'm so glad that you introduced those principles of psychology into the discussion. So think about it. And what I'm really going to do, Kai, is paraphrase what you said. In order for me to harm you, somehow up here, I really have to devalue you as a human being. Do you see that? So that's where this messaging comes in, that they put out into the airways and on TV about Black males. And you have to understand, this didn't start yesterday. This has been perpetuated in our country repetitively for many, many years. So much to the extent that Black people believe that about other Black people. How about that? Do you understand that? And that's all psychology. That's why we have to understand that this is precisely what we've seen over the past few years. So many unarmed Black people killed. And in looking at it, there is no, you have to understand that it's deliberate. It's no accident. They don't need any training. Just like Schilling in several years ago shot the guy in the back multiple times. Didn't know he was being video recorded. Caught him on video kicking a weapon over close to the guy's body. Shot him in the back. There's no training that can fix that. Let me explain to you about the law enforcement training piece. The law enforcement training piece is no different in theory of how you would address any other issue with any other common employee. Supervisors monitor two things with employees. You know what those two things are? They monitor employees' performance and they monitor employees' conduct. Let me explain to you the definition of the two and their contrasts and how they differ. Performance is about what an employee can't do or is incapable of doing. You address employee performance issues through mentoring, coaching, training. Let me say that again. Training. You address performance problems, performance issues through coaching, mentoring, training, and supervision. Conduct, right? We talk about conduct. Follow me now. Conduct, on the other hand, is about what an employee won't do or refuses to do. And conduct is almost always surrounding organizational policy, meaning what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do. Do you know how conduct problems are addressed? Conduct problems are addressed through disciplinary actions and supervision methods. The only thing that links performance and conduct as relates to employees is supervision. That's the only link between those two. You address performance issues through training. You address conduct matters through disciplinary measures, actions. Those conduct. So that is another misnomer. And I want to say that again. That is another misnomer that we continue to funnel through the airwaves, through the media, through the newspaper about all of these police officers need money. Those police officers are well trained. You can't train somebody to be nice. You can't train somebody to have integrity. You can't train someone to have character. You can't train that. How you gonna train them after he shot this guy in the back? You think he didn't know what he was doing? The fact of the matter is, these police officers are criminals. They're criminals. They're gangsters with badges. And this from somebody whose father was a law enforcement officer and whose son is a law enforcement. That's what we're dealing with. So that's my response to the police officers need more training. Here's something else. Stop putting police officers to police communities that they have no relationship with. And it's not, and we don't even necessarily even have to label that a black or white issue. But the reality is you don't need to put white police officers in a community that they have no relationship with. Everywhere I've lived in my life in America, police officers, and they're largely white, have relationships with the people in the community that they patrol, except in black communities. Rarely have I seen that in any black community that I've lived. And I've frequent and spent time in both black and white communities throughout America, with friends and family and that kind of thing. So you have a different set of dynamics. This is the other thing. This is not, and so for members of your white audience that are listening, this is not, me beating up on white people. This is telling you the complexity of what we live in here in America. And we have very different sets of we're one culture, but we're multiple cultures within America. And you have one culture within America that is treated very differently from another culture. And that's fact. There's no ifs, ands, or but about that. And we need to accept that and understand that in order for us to move beyond that, rectify that, and mitigate those problems relating to it.
So true. And I think, Thurston, we saw evidence of that. I think, what was it, the Mohammed Noor case in Minnesota?
Right.
When the officer, he had shot and killed, I think the white Australian woman. He said he feared for his life. I believe he had said that she had charged him, shot her. He's in prison.
Right.
You know, there was no putting him on, on leave or desk assignment. He is in prison.
Right.
And we didn't hear anything from Blue Lives Matter. Right. How could this happen? Doing this to him, that's going to hinder our ability to do our job. We heard none of that.
Right.
So that's a clear example to what you just stated, that you have groups of people living here having totally different experiences and the laws being applied differently based on race.
That's correct. And you know, the reality of it is, every incident that we've seen a black guy, a black man killed in this country over the past couple of years, just about every individual that I've spoken with that's non-black have come up with some excuse. That's absolutely profound. Have coming up with some excuse or why the shooting of that person was warranted. And see, that's, you have to understand, that should scare us. And let me tell you why that should scare us. Because when you see the definition of truth is the absolute standard by which reality is measured. That's why if I tell you it's raining, right, you can look through that window and verify. Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify, right? You can look through that window and you'll know whether or not I'm telling you the truth, because you know what rain is. But here we've got black folks shot and killed all over the place, all kind of bizarre circumstances. Walking, jogging, sitting, selling cigars, running. Every possible setting you can think of, we don't have the permission to exist. Kill an 11-year-old boy, a 12-year-old boy with a cap gun in a state that allows concealed carry, if I remember that correctly. They shot and killed him. And it's always we thought. I've heard white police officers say they shot an unarmed black guy because the police officer was scared. The police officers got the gun, not the guy. He kills the guy who's unarmed, but the police officer said he was scared. But black people are not entitled to be scared. But then I still have people tell me, come up with some way, some form of rationale that justifies those officers killing those people time and time again. And that's real scary, because anytime you're looking somebody in the eye, you know what reality is. I've just given you the definition of truth, right? You know what reality is. You know that wall is blue. You know that wall is blue. You know it's blue. You got your glasses on, everything. And then somebody standing right next to you, for all intents and purposes, you know is somebody of fair intelligence. They tell you, no, that wall is pink. That's profound. And not only do they tell you the wall is pink, they are like almost willing to risk their lives for that. Now, what does that tell you? Something is wrong with the psychology of America. America is a sick society. People are sick, and lots of folks are in deep, deep denial. There's a fancy term that we use now to describe that. It's called cognitive dissonance. And it is absolutely profound. See, it's one thing being crazy. There's an entirely different thing being crazy and then acting upon it. And we've been seeing a lot of that in America.
Agreed, Thurston. As we can continue to have this conversation, but as we start to wind down our conversation tonight, I wanted to also bring this up. So we're starting to speak more about the trauma, historical trauma that African Americans have experienced in this country.
Right.
And I am really appreciative of Dr. Joy DeGrew's work. Her work was really the inspiration to me starting this podcast. Yeah. So I'm really thankful for the work that she's done.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to bring up, when we talk about policing in this country and we see Black bodies getting shot, and it's trending on Facebook, it's on Instagram, people are sharing it, what that's saying to the Black community. We've talked a little bit about that, but I also want to talk about when we think about slavery and the brutality of that, and the brutality of lynching and the torture that was used during slavery, post-slavery. I guess I'm not necessarily a question for you to ask, but for the listeners and viewers to think about, what does that do to a group of people? And again, I'm generally speaking, putting everybody in a group whose families, whose lineage participated in this brutality of enslaving someone, rape, different types of torture, and then lynching, in which I was preparing for this workshop. And for the workshop, I was presenting on historical trauma and how it played out, and how that is also much well and alive in our in the medical field, of how doctors and such view Black patients when they say they're in pain.
Right.
Anyway, so going back to my point, so there were these newspaper articles that were written and said, oh, come down to the center of town, it's going to be the lynching of such and such, come on down. So people are coming down, bringing their children to watch this. Members of the white community are bring their children down to watch this, to watch a person get lynched, have a picnic, sending out postcards. So if this is something that, when we look at epigenetics and what's being passed down from one generation to the next, I definitely, I think the white community has to look at that. What does that do to your psyche of now trying to say, I understand racism, right? I want to extend the olive branch to the Black community, but we have to deal with all of what was done, of you seeing us as less than.
Right. You know what makes racism in America so insidious? Kind of imagine being raped by someone. And I know that's probably hard, and maybe that's not the best analogy, right? But since I opened up Pandora's box, I better go through it and close it. But I'm gonna close it properly.
No, I know where you're going with. This is good. This is good.
And as we say in the treatment field, if you're gonna open up Humpty Dumpty, you better know how to put them back together properly, right? So, but imagine a woman being raped, brutally raped. Well, any rape. You know, you don't talk about the rape is rape, right? Which is a crime of power. I want to make that really clear, right? It's not about sex. Sex is the symptom. Rape is a crime of power. But imagine being raped by someone and then thereafter being forced to interact with the rapist, who tells you that he didn't rape you. But then every now and then he drops these microaggressions that are directly related to the act of rape. That's what it's like, magnified multiple times, of dealing with racism in America. I got an email from a colleague of mine today regarding this, white lady, having a discussion with me. And she said to me, what do blacks want? And it's kind of interesting. It sounded like she was kind of angry in her email. And I tried to explain to her, well, number one, you made my point based upon several things that you said. You don't have to deal with this. That's what privilege is. You don't have, you have to understand, we were brought here to make your lives comfortable. We were forced to learn your culture. In fact, I would argue that we know them as good as they know themselves, if not better. We were forced. We were forced when we were born here to abandon everything African, except our skills in agriculture, which is why they bought us here. We bought okra here, just to let you know that, right? So imagine being forced to adopt all of these practices. Meanwhile, you're abusing the individual in the process. So the psychology and the trauma of that is overwhelming. And what makes it bad, what makes it so bad, is that even when you're trying to have conversations about it, and meaningful conversations and fruitful discussions, you're met with the denial and resistance. And you have to understand something about that. And so some of that, I would argue, is denial. Some of that is just outright fear. Whenever you have to understand, there are two emotions. There are two core emotions. Love, everything positive comes from that one emotion. And fear, everything negative comes from that. Anger is a byproduct of fear. Fear is the core emotion, not anger. Anger is the emotion that's displayed when the individual doesn't want to effectively deal with their fear. And fear is about one or two things. Now we're going to get to the core of the discussion. Fear is about one or two things, Kyle. Fear is either I'm not going to get what I want, or you're going to take away what I have. Now, if they're getting angry and they're fearful when you bring up black issues, what are they afraid of? They're afraid of losing something or not getting something. So let's focus on the loser. What do they lose? Well, somehow they believe, right, whoever they are, but they believe that if black people do well, they're going to do poorly. Now, why think like that, I don't understand. But only thing, you're only left, and you know this as a healthcare practitioner, you're only left with theories after analyzing all of the various behaviors. And after analyzing all of the various behaviors, which are consistent with a particular group over a particular time, and the behaviors are congruent, meaning that they're not abnormal for what we have been witnessing, then you're only left with coming up with one or two logical conclusions. And that is that America does not want to see, and I say America, I mean by and large, that does not want to see Black people succeed. This is my belief, because we have evidence of when America wants to accomplish something for another group, it makes it happen. No questions asked, it gets done. But there's always some issue. You know, just like I was listening to conservative radio the other day, they're talking about, or, you know, socialism. Anytime, you know, yeah, you're arguing for civil rights, you must be aligned with socialism somehow. Not that you're deserving of being treated as a decent human being, but let me devalue you by calling you a name. And they did that when King was here. They called him a socialist and a communist. Anytime Black folks fight for equality or fight for equity, you're going to get called the name. See, that's how you do. You vilify the person. You make them into an animal. You devalue them as a human being. That way, you don't have to honor their requests. That's the psychology. There's lots of psychology involved in this, even with the concept of defund the police, which was a bad concept, although I understand where it came from. And the reason why I threw that in there is because I know that we were supposed to talk about that.
Yeah, I know. Can you speak to that, Thurston, before we wrap up?
Well, so let me tell you where that came from. That also came from growing frustration with many in America of how the criminal justice system has historically and continues to treat Blacks. And so, and by and large, the term defund the police came out of the progressive movement. There's another title, and other folks probably call them liberals. I understand intuitively where they were coming from. When they said defund the police, they didn't mean shut police departments down. They meant stop giving police all of these additional monies and So let me explain this to you as somebody that served in the armed forces, and not to go on a tangent. You hear different politicians talk about, well, they cut funding to the Department of Defense, and you think that when the public hears that, the public interprets that as they're not giving the members of the armed forces raises. They're not, giving them proper uniforms. It's not that. When you hear that term, what they're really talking about is they cut funding to defense contractors. You got defense contractors that make the MREs that we eat in the military, which comes in a bag. You got M&Ms in there, stuff that soldiers and troops can eat in the field. Those are made by defense contractors. net that goes on the helmet is made by a totally different defense contractor. It's all money. It's all money. So it's not the Obama and Clinton was gutting the military. America still has the best, the biggest, and the brightest military force in the world, bar none. But this is the propaganda they use. So I'm using that as an example to say when that term defund the police came out, it was simply a way of saying stop giving police departments and police divisions all of these special pots of money for their special perks. Not that those perks weren't necessary, but what the progressives were saying, use the purse string to get their attention. But it was a bad term because of how, number one, how it sounded, and number one, and number two, how the people on the other side, right, were able to twist that to mean something, to take it, to blow it way out of proportion. But the term, generally, to sum it up, the term defund the police was a term used to let's hit them in the purse string, but not that the intent was not to shut down law enforcement, but it was just a bad term.
I'm glad that you explained that, because I know when that was first being said, it was just a lot of confusion because there were really also no set talking points that people were using to explain what it meant.
Right.
So that's very helpful. So everyone that has been watching this episode, please like this video. Please subscribe to the Healing Element podcast YouTube channel. On this podcast, we talk a lot about the experiences of African Americans as it relates to trauma and historical trauma, because a lot of what we've gone through hasn't really been expressed. People are doing the work within community, but we really want to continue platforms such as this to get the word out so that we as a community also know where we can go for help. Thurston does a lot of speaking engagements talking about substance use, mental health in the Black community specifically. So, everyone who I bring on a platform is meant to provide us with information, but also how we can begin to heal ourselves, our families, and then communities. So thank you everyone for your support. And like I said, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe, and also share. Thurston, as we wind down, I think this is my third time saying wind down the conversation, because this is such a important topic that we had tonight. And with everything that we talked about with Jim Crow and the juvenile justice system, defund the police and policing in this country, it all relates back to, we have to look back at the history of everything to understand where we are right now. So thankful that you were able to break all of that down. And I just wanted to say really quick to listeners, and then Thurston, please, I want to hear your final thoughts. When we're talking about generational trauma and beginning, and us as a community internalizing what's being said about us, it's so important that we know our history and also begin to heal. So if you are watching right now, I think it would be great if you would go to season 1 of my podcast, and the first 6 episodes, I go into detail about Dr. Joyce DeGroo's work, post-traumatic slave syndrome. The first 6 episodes, it breaks down what that is, how it shows up in our lives, and that's a great starting point. And then you can go from there, get her book, and begin to learn more about this generational trauma and how living in such a system, when you begin to internalize that, it is not going to bode well for you or your family or your community. So if this generational trauma, inherited trauma is something new to you, going to season 1 of my podcast, the first 6 episodes, I lay out exactly what post-traumatic slave syndrome is, how it shows up in our lives. And once we begin to understand that, we can begin the healing process. So I just wanted to quickly mention that. Thurston, are there any final words that you would like to leave with our audience? Thanks so much for coming back to the podcast. You are always welcome here. This is your home. But any final words that you have?
Yeah, well, since you, and thanks again for having me, guys, since you referenced intergenerational trauma, it kind of hit me. The reason why America is so sick is because it will not, it has refused to come to terms with and resolve its history of racism. That's why, and you know as well as I do, even if you're dealing with denial is at the core of all mental illness. And when the more you deny the problem, the more prominent and profound it comes. It comes out in different ways. And this is why we continue to see the reaction that we see. Both the victim and the perpetrator need to heal, and they need to heal together. And the reality of it is we cannot heal but together, because we are together, yet we are so divided. It's been indeed a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure to have you on. We'll be back soon. But no, this was great. I hope that everybody found this information helpful. Please do share this with your friends and family. It's so important that we as a community begin to understand our value, our worth, and our contributions to this country, and really begin to build our esteem up, because our esteem has been severely damaged. We are a beautiful people. We are a wonderful people. And it's time that we start to acknowledge that and appreciate who and what we are. So thank you, everyone who has joined. The Healing Element Podcast season 3 is going to start in July of this year. But until then, excuse me, I'll be running several specials on the platform. So please make sure you stay tuned for that. Visit my website, kaimarie.com, to learn more about the services that I offer. Also check me out on Instagram, kaimarie_LLC, and also at the Healing Element Podcast. Thank you all so much for joining. Thurston, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great night.
Good night. Bye-bye.